Excellent. Thank you very much, Richard. And hello again to everybody. So welcome to this session, which, as you can see, is as advertised, called Personality Type and Reactions to Pandemic. But actually, although that's the advertised title, that's sort of what we're talking about. I guess what's at the heart of what we're talking about today is really about well-being, how that relates to type, and how that may or may not have changed following COVID. So that's what we're going to be talking about over the next hour. So thank you very much for coming along. I won't introduce Richard myself because Richard has already done a wonderful job of doing that. So let's talk about what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to start off in a moment with Rich. There he is in his blue shirt. And he's going to start by talking to us about well-being, what it is, how we measure it, and especially how it applies to the workplace well-being, if you will. And he'll go on to say a little bit about our research into workplace well-being. And as you'll see, that's really pretty relevant to how we reacted to COVID and where perhaps we are now in what is sort of turning into a post-pandemic world. And then I'll go on to talk about the effects of COVID in more detail, the effects on well-being, but on our reactions more generally, and how this related to type. And I'll then go on to look at what seems to be one very lasting effect of a pandemic, the move to remote working and hybrid working, and that'll draw on some very recent research that we haven't actually published yet. So you get a nice sneak preview of that. And that will also let us say something about what makes us now in this changed world, what makes people or helps people to feel positive about their working life. And of course, that takes us back to well-being. And Rich is going to talk about how we can improve workplace well-being and how this relates to type. And just as Richard said, to reassure, it's not just be me and Rich talking. We're going to have breakout groups, polls, chance for you to just stop and think and reflect a little bit along the way. And as you go through, please do ask questions. Because there's quite a few of you, we may not see all your hands raised, so please do put your questions in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. So that's the overall plan for the next hour or the next 55 minutes. But now, without further ado, Rich, over to you.
All right, thanks, John. Thanks, Richard, and thanks everybody for being here. I appreciate the opportunity to present at BAPT. So we're going to talk about workplace well-being and start off with talking about well-being in general. So the quest for happiness or well-being is age-old. Buddha taught that we are what we think, and all that arises with our thoughts. And with our thoughts, we make the world. So according to Buddha, happiness is a result of our thoughts. Aristotle proposed that the ultimate purpose in life is to achieve the good life by focusing on virtues. Thomas Jefferson, in a US nod, included the right to the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. And Maslow presented a well-known hierarchy of human needs and steps to get to self-actualization. So people have been thinking about this for a very long time. In most recent years, a guy named Martin Seligman has proposed a theory of well-being that really looks at well-being in general and is focused on 5 factors that individually contribute to your overall state of well-being, that people pursue for their own sake, and that are independent of the other factors. So if you think about well-being over time and how humans work on well-being, finding ways to improve well-being has been a goal for people throughout human history. For the majority of the last 200,000 years or so, modern humans have been around. Well-being was constantly threatened by lack of food, diseases, and wars. However, in the last 150 years or so, those threats have declined, and instead we have new challenges to well-being. And we were more likely to die today of obesity, old age, or suicide than disease and war. However, for many of us, for the first time in a very long time, this COVID pandemic came along and it really changed our relationship with well-being. People around the world are facing this challenge. For many, the pandemic is perhaps the biggest challenge to their well-being in their lifetime, and it has at times felt like a survival exercise rather than trying to thrive for the last few years. So for us, the focus, so well-being is important, but for us, the focus has been on workplace well-being and the role that MBTI or personality type plays in that. For many people, work is a major part of their life. They may be focused on their well-being in general, but often don't include workplace well-being as part of their efforts. And workplace well-being contributes to one's overall sense of well-being or wellness. And like I said, it's a big part of many people's lives in an area that's often not included when they're thinking about well-being. So not only is it important to focus on well-being and workplace well-being for its own sake, but research has shown that having a higher level of well-being in general also leads to positive outcomes for organizations. On the screen is a summary, and I'm not going to go through them all, of different studies that have looked at well-being in general and organizational outcomes. But to summarize, what we see is that when people have, quote, a good day at work, 28% are more productive, 31% say they're more creative, and 70% are more likely to recommend their organization to others. So I want to take a moment before we get into measurement and do a quick poll. Just once it comes up, we'll ask you just rate, how are you feeling today?
So our poll should have appeared on your screens now if I've done it properly, and it has, because at least one person's answered.
Yeah.
So let's get those answers in.
So generally speaking, people are somewhere between good and great. Some are okay. There's no one who's not good at all.
Okay, let me end the poll and show the results.
So that, little poll is just one way of very quickly doing a quick check on your well-being. But of course, we spent a lot more time and energy trying to do a deeper measure, if you will, of workplace well-being. And John, do I have to change that? Okay.
No, hopefully. Now you're witnessing the seamy underbelly of how Zoom works. Hopefully I've moved that poll off your screens.
It's off my screen now. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is a quick self-reflection exercise. I'm going to ask some questions. You've already given us your overall kind of subjective, how are you feeling today? But for each of these, I want you to spend a moment thinking about it and then type into the chat your reaction to the question. So the first question is, think about the last situation where you felt sustained positive emotion at work, whether it was joy, cheerfulness, happiness, amusement, or awe. And how did that sustained positive emotion affect your work? If you would, just type a quick answer into the chat. And I have to pull the chat up.
That's all right. And if you don't want to commit yourself to the chat, feel free to make it a self-reflection exercise and put it on a piece of paper.
That's fine too, yeah. So you're seeing some answers, more engaged, in a state of flow, positive things like that. We're not going to spend too much time on this. Keep typing in your answers. There'll be lots of answers to type in. John, go ahead to the next one. So think of a person you have a positive relationship with at work. What makes that relationship positive for you? If you don't mind just typing that in. What makes that relationship positive? Shared values, trust, they're like-minded, humor, some great answers, communication. So keep on typing those in while we move on to the next one, John. Now think of a time when you thoroughly enjoyed a work activity that used your strengths and talents. What was that experience like for you? You don't mind typing those into the chat? Or self-reflecting, as John suggested. So satisfying, fun, happy, rewarding. So it's a great experience when it happens. Go ahead, John, to the next one. Think of a role or an activity you undertake at work that gives you a sense of meaning and purpose. How does it help you and others when you have that sense of meaning and purpose? Go ahead and type those in if you are so inclined. Motivational is a great answer. This one's a little harder, maybe. More positive, channel your energy, in tune. Excellent. Go ahead, John. Now think of something that gives you a sense of achievement at work. How does that achievement make you feel? Pride, great. Meh. Useful. Love the meh. Useful. Happy, fulfilled, excellent. Peacefulness. Last one. Think about a time when you had or felt a strong negative emotion at work, whether you're angry, depressed, something like that. How did that affect your work and your day? Slowed me down. Stopped. Going too fast. Lack of concentration. Less productive. Demotivating. So the point of this exercise really was to do two things. One is to show, like we just showed before, that your state of well-being has an impact on your work, which is probably not surprising to most people, but it also shows a little bit about how we're approaching workplace well-being. So the questions that we asked show the model that we've created from our research. Seligman has 5 elements in his model. The work that we did showed that positive and negative emotions are separate, which makes sense. You can experience positive emotions and then, have something happen and immediately experience negative emotions. So they're not as if they are having one precludes the other. So our model breaks those out into 2 different elements of the measure. And the reason we asked those questions before is they show you what elements we have in our model. So the idea of positive emotions is that, experience of joy, something positive happening at work, you're feeling good about yourself. Relationships was the question about having a person who is, a positive relationship for you at work. Engagement is about being engaged, doing something that you thoroughly enjoy, that uses your strengths and talents. Meaning is the idea that the work you have gives you a sense of meaning and purpose. Accomplishment means that you're getting something done and it makes you feel good when you accomplish it, except for that person who said meh. And like I said, then you can also experience negative emotions. And of course, those detract from your overall level of well-being. So that's the 5 elements of the model. We're going to spend time on the results of our measures over time, looking at overall workplace well-being, as well as those elements. So we've been doing this work since 2016, and in that time, we've collected data from over 20,000 people over that 6-year period. Normally, in the work that we do, go ahead, the next one, John. When we're doing survey research with people who've taken the MBTI, our responses are typically 2/3 female and 1/3 male. That's just what we normally get. I don't know if it's certainly not what we're sampling, but it's the people that are answering the questions. And then the average age of the sample is about 43, but we have people ranging in age from 18 to 86. And so that's across those 6 different years. And so real briefly then, just what does well-being look like, workplace well-being look like over that time period? And so this chart shows we measure well-being on a 1 to 10 scale. Multiple items per, it's not just those ones we asked before, but it's multiple items per element in the pre-men model. And this chart shows you a couple things. First of all, if you look at overall well-being, you see it's about a 7.5. You can see there's some differences in terms of emotion and relationships. Negative emotion is measured as, are you experiencing it? So a higher level of negative emotion is actually a negative for your well-being. But what we see is that, generally speaking, and this is true of other research as well, people, regardless of their situation, tend to rate their well-being, their happiness, their life in general fairly high. You find that even in areas that where people are very, very poor, they tend to have fairly high ratings. So this is in line with what we see in other research. And it also suggests that, even when things are going crazy in the world, people are still pretty resilient. So this just gives you an overall idea of what it looks like in terms of the 6 years of data that we've collected. John, you want to go on to the next one? So now we'll show you a trend of what we see over time. And a quick question, anybody have any thoughts? You might dump it into the chat about what might have happened after the pandemic started to people's overall well-being and workplace well-being. Any guesses? Couple of answers. Tanked, I like it. Well, it did go down, but it didn't go down as much as you might have thought. So you can see the trends here. And John, go ahead and click the next one to kind of show the dip. But you'll see that the data we have, and there's different samples of folks. Some people have taken the instrument, multiple times across different years. But generally speaking, regardless of what's happening in the world, the workplace well-being levels stay pretty high. Although there is clearly a dip in 2021 from 2020 or 2019. But it wasn't like a huge, somebody had said tanked. It didn't necessarily tank, but it certainly decreased. So you say, so that's our overall data looking at overall well-being. So what's the role of type in workplace well-being? So looking again across those, aggregated across those different timelines, we've been looking at this for some years. Anybody have a guess as to which type preferences have the highest level of workplace well-being? Anyone?
No one's Plato.
ESTJ? What's that? ENTJ? ENTJ? All right, John, let's do the reveal.
Da, da, da.
Da, da, da. So ESTJ has the highest, and I forgot to ask about the other group, but any guesses on who has the lowest overall? Don't look at the bars. IXFPs, INFPs, INFPs. Okay, John, go ahead. It's actually ISTPs who have the lowest level of well-being, and that has been consistent every year we've done this. The highest level of workplace well-being tends to go back and forth between ENTPs and ESTJs, but the ISTPs have consistently had the lowest. Now, I want to point out that doesn't look like a huge difference, right? It's a 0.8 difference. We'll call it a 1-point difference on a 10-point scale. Because we're using a 10-point scale, it's really about a 10% difference. And so that is actually kind of sizable and something to keep in mind when you're looking at types. You can also see on the chart that introverts, as a general rule, have lower levels of overall well-being than extroverts. And that's just a consistent finding across all of the different things we look at. So we're gonna now put on the other elements, John. So when we're looking at the pre-man model, you can see once again that for positive emotions, people with a preference for E are higher, and it's even slightly higher for people with a preference for EJ. Positive emotions are lower for people with a preference for I, and slightly lower for people with a preference for IP. In terms of relationships, they're higher for people with a preference for E again, slightly higher for people with a preference for extroversion and feeling, and relationship ratings are slightly lower, are lower for people with I, and slightly lower for people with a preference for introversion and thinking. In terms of engagement's higher for people with an E again, slightly higher for, and a little bit lower for people with introversion. No other preferences played a role in that. For meaning, it's higher for people with an E and slightly higher for people with extroversion and judging. It's lower for people with a preference for introversion, of course, and particularly people with a sensing and judging preference. And accomplishments higher for people with E. It's highest for ENJs, and it's lowest for Is, and it's lowest for IPs, and it's a little bit higher for IJs. And in terms of negative emotions, this one is, introverts tend to experience a slightly higher level of negative emotions. And for extroverts, the highest level of negative emotions are people with an ESTP preference. So type plays a role. The differences on these are not huge. Because of the sample size, they would be, quote, statistically significant. But the patterns that we see here in this overall data plays out year in and year out. And so there's probably something going on that is true and type related in terms of people's overall levels of workplace well-being. So when we think about the pandemic, then we ask the question, what happened to people's overall level of workplace well-being? And we have the data from 2019 and 2021, and we're comparing those. I should say, and I didn't say this before, we collect this data every year in the May-June timeframe. So in the 2019 data, well before the pandemic, 2020 data, it was just getting going. And then in 2021, we were in the complete throes of the pandemic. Real quick, any thoughts about what? Oh. That's all right.
You have to be quick. Have to be quick.
Go ahead and put it on, John. So as you can see here, for whatever reason, the ENTPs and ESTPs took a fairly large hit in their workplace well-being in the midst of the pandemic. And again, for whatever reason, we haven't fully explored this, the ENTJs and the ESFPs, perhaps the ENFPs, the pandemic didn't have as big of an impact on their workplace well-being. This is something that we've just started looking at in terms of what might have been going on. So I don't have any great answers for you, but again, clearly type plays a role in how people reacted to the pandemic from a well-being perspective.
Okay. So thank you very much for that, Risk. So we just talked then about the overall impact of the last couple of years of well-being. And what we're going to do now is to look at the effects of the pandemic in a bit more detail. But before I get into the details of research, I'm going to see if we can hear from you. And I'd like you to take just a few moments to think back, to cast your minds back to spring 2020. Think about what your initial reactions to COVID were. What words might you use to describe your feelings at the time, and how perhaps have those feelings changed since then? And maybe even what effect do you think your type preferences had on that? So just take a moment to write down a few notes, not necessarily in the chat, just in a notebook, a bit of paper if you want to, because in a moment we're going to ask you to join a breakout group. And I'd like you in your breakout group just to discuss amongst yourselves your experiences, your answers to those questions. And I think, Richard, we said we're going to give them 6 minutes. Was that right? Because, oh, sorry, Richard, I forgot we weren't recording. Because back in spring and summer 2020, we ran a research study into people's reactions to the pandemic. And one of the things we did back then was to ask people to think of 3 words that summed up their feelings about COVID. And there were hundreds of different words that people mentioned, but here are the most common ones. And I'm conscious that you maybe need to, at this point, to get a magnifying glass out and look at your screen really closely. But this is being recorded, and I am going to also send to Richard a PDF of the slides so you can actually read the details of it. But the most frequent by some margin was anxiety or anxious, and that was mentioned by 56 times across the survey. Then feeling sad, being sad or sadness, but then opportunity. So it wasn't all bad, and so on. And of course, there's some overlap between these different words. So being anxious at the top there, that isn't 100 miles away from being worried, the 5th one down. So we group those words into themes or categories. But again, you'll see about that wider theme of being anxious or confused or worried, or fearful, or scared. That was the most common theme, with 211 mentions. So you might want to have a little quick look at those words there on your screen, if you can read them, if you've got a big enough monitor, and think to what extent that compared with the sort of discussions you were having. And feel free to put any thoughts, observations about that in the chat. Okay, is that broken down by age? Not in this slide, Carol, but it probably is in the full report, which you can download from the website, I think, from memory. And there were some age differences, yes, that we reported. Just can't remember off the top of my head exactly where they were. And there were, of course, also type differences between how people saw the pandemic. So, for example, people with a feeling preference were more likely than those with a thinking preference to use words like anxious, worried, or scared, and words like stressed, overwhelmed, or exhausted, and words like lonely, isolated, and disconnected. But actually, we saw those differences in type most clearly when we asked people specific questions about their behaviors or opinions. And one thing I should say here is that when we asked people to name 3 words, we got all this negative stuff, as you can see. When we ask people more specific questions about their behavior, in general, there's a much more positive picture. But there were type differences. So as you might expect, people with an extroversion preference were less keen, on average, on working from home than those with introversion preference. Well, actually, even introverts, even extroverts, generally felt reasonably positive about working from home. But if we're thinking in terms of well-being, which is the core of what we're talking about today, it was thinking, feeling, and also judging, perceiving. That's probably the most relevant. So we asked people, for example, how much they agreed with that statement, work is stressful, and compared results of people for judging preference for people with perceiving preference. Any guesses in the chat, perhaps, at which direction that difference might go? Because there was a significant difference. No takers? Okay. Judging, strongly agree. Whoever said judging is absolutely right. Those with a judging preference, 55% of those agreed or strongly agreed that work is stressful, and 47% of those with perceiving preference. Now, it's possible, certainly, that this, because this was done at the time of the pandemic, was concerned with uncertainty and such change around the time of lockdown, because on some research we've just completed, where we asked basically the same question, we didn't find the same JP difference. But certainly at the time of lockdown, when that was all happening, we did find that difference. And there were also a number of questions that people with thinking preference answered differently from those with feeling preference. And you can see those questions there. And people answer those questions on a 1 to 4 scale, as you can see. And we're going to look at the average, the mean score for each question. So essentially anything above that line is more agree, anything below that line is more disagree. This is how, on average, thinking respondents answered those questions. And here are the averages for feeling respondents. And these are all statistically significant differences. In general, people with a feeling preference saw working from home in a less positive way than those with a thinking preference. They're more likely to think they were becoming too isolated, more likely to find it difficult to concentrate or remain focused on work when working from home, more likely to say they wish they didn't have to work from home, and much more likely to suffer from what's being called survivor guilt, to feel guilty when they still had a job when others have lost theirs. And if you remember back to that time, many organizations were making people redundant or furloughing people. People with a thinking preference are much less likely to feel guilty about that than people with a feeling preference. Interestingly, the type which was least likely to feel guilty, I'm afraid, was people with ITP preferences. You might also remember that, harking back to the previous slide, people with a feeling preference were more likely to use negative words to describe their feelings about the pandemic. Now, that shift to remote working at the start of lockdown was something that affected lots of people and may well have affected their well-being. But before I look at what our research says, let's get your views on this, or rather where you were on this. So I'm going to launch a poll now which asks you about your status in terms of remote working. Were you someone, and you may have to increase the size of that window, I've just realized, because looking at my screen you can't see all of the question. Before COVID, were you a remote or hybrid worker, and you are now? Or perhaps before COVID you were a remote worker but now you're back to working in the office? Or before COVID you were working in an office or a workplace but now you're remote? Or before COVID you worked in an office and now you continue to do so? So let me just give you a moment to let those questions come in. So about 2/3 of you had answered. Let's see if we get a few more of you to answer. Up to 3/4. Not that I'm keeping score. 86%. Any more for any more? This is where I need my auctioneer's gavel. Going, going, gone. So let's share those results. So we have the largest single group, nearly half of you mostly worked in an office or other workplace before COVID, but now you're remote. Quite a lot of you, 40%, were already remote workers, and you still are. And a few of you worked in an office and now you've gone back there. And in a sense, I guess you might be a little bit of an atypical group, because before COVID, probably many more people worked in an office, whereas many of you already worked remotely beforehand. And we can see that if we look at data, let me just stop sharing that. If we look at data from our own database, because when people complete the American version of the Myers-Briggs type indicator, one of the demographic questions we ask them is, what percentage of the time do you work remotely? Is it none or hardly any of your time, 0 to 10%? Is it all or almost all your time, 90 to 100%? Or is it somewhere in between? And if we go back 10 years to 2012, 3/4 of people who took the MBTI assessment weren't working remotely at all, and only 5% will work remotely all or almost all the time. If you have a very small monitor, you have to take my word on some of those numbers, but that's what they said. As we go from 2013 down to 2019, those numbers hardly change at all. And then, surprise, surprise, the percentage of remote workers suddenly escalates in 2020, and especially in 2021. And we can see that play out through the 2 years from January 2020, because at the start of 2020, this green line represents the people who work remotely nearly all the time. Only 6% of the group did at the start of that time. By the early part of last year, it had gone up to 38%. By the end of last year, it has started to go down again. And conversely, at the start of 2020, nearly 2/3 of people were working in an office or the workplace. That dipped down rapidly as COVID happened, down ultimately to about 1/3. And now it's starting to go back up again. Now, of course, many of those people who were working from home may actually not have wanted to do so. And it may well be that the way you work now isn't your ideal. Now, this isn't a poll for you to fill in, just something you might want to think about. What's your own preference when it comes to remote working? Do you work remotely would you rather work remotely rather more than you do now? Or rather less than you do now? Or perhaps you're just in that sweet spot where at your preferred level? Okay. And we asked people the same sort of question in a recent survey. And this, as I said, is a bit of sneak preview because we haven't crunched over numbers yet or produced a report. But one of the things we did, we asked people, what would be your ideal? What percentage of the time, ideally, would you like to spend working remotely or at home? And along the bottom of this chart, you'll see the different answers that people could give. Did they want to spend none of their time working remotely, up to 10% of their time working remotely, and so on. And the scale at the left-hand side obviously shows the percentage of the total that will be in each group. And this is what we found. Just 3% said their idea was to spend none of their time working remotely. A quarter to spend less than half their time working remotely. Over half, 53%, to spend more than half, but not all their time working remotely. And 19% to spend all their time working remotely. So that was people's preference. But of course, we also asked them what they actually did. How much of their time did they actually spend working remotely? And this is what we found. More than twice as many people were working entirely in the office than wanted to, 8% compared with 3%. Almost twice as many people were working entirely remotely than actually were referred to, 33% compared with 19%. And less people were working in the middle categories, in what we might call a hybrid way. I'm sure you heard about the term hybrid working used, but 1 to 2. And in fact, across the data as a whole, 42% were working remotely more than they wanted to, 31% were working remotely less than they wanted to, and only 27% were working remotely at a level that matched their ideal preference. And looking at the people who either always work remotely or never work remotely, there were even bigger discrepancies. 84% of those who never worked remotely were referred to do so at least some of the time. 61% of those who always worked remotely would rather not do so all the time. So for me, there's something of a lesson about choice here. And it's also worthwhile noting that there are some type differences here. ISTPs and ENFPs are the most likely types to be at a preferred level of remote working. ISFPs and ENTJs the least. I know that Rich in particular likes this chart because he works remotely. I believe he's very happy doing so. And his type preferences are, as you can see from his name, ISTP. But whatever our preference, most of us probably do work remotely at least some of the time. And at this point, I was going to go to a breakout group, but I'm looking at the time, and I suspect we may not have time to do this. So let me just ask you instead to put in the chat, perhaps, to think briefly about what you like to do, what you like about remote working, what you dislike, and just put a few words in the chat. So first of all, a few things about what you like about remote working. Just type a few odds and ends in the chat. Set my own schedule, like the ability to focus. A few more, good use of time. Okay, what about the easy question? What's the worst thing about remote working? Okay, a few more good things coming in. What about the worst thing about remote working? What's bad about it? Boundaries, tech not working. Thank you, Catherine. Being around for children, isolation, socially isolating. Okay, not being able to get a second opinion in real time. Okay, so thank you for those. Now, those answers are, I think, reflected in data we had from our survey because we asked the same sort of questions. This is what people said was the best thing about working from home. Not having to commute was actually the most mentioned advantage, followed by having flexibility and freedom. There were some differences. More women and men mentioned quiet and having time to yourself. And interestingly, people with a feeling preference were more than twice as likely as those with a thinking preference to mention being comfortable, being relaxed, being sort of just at home, compared with those with a thinking preference. People with an NT preference were most likely to mention flexibility and freedom, which I think is something I just saw come up in your comments in the chat there. And if we look at the worst thing about working from home, by far the most common theme was being isolated and having a little no contact, especially face-to-face contact. And that's something, just looking at the chat, that a number of you had said. And interestingly, 6% of the group said there was nothing bad about working from home. There was no worst. And that contrasts with the graph on the left-hand side, where just one single person, less than 0.25% of the total, said there was nothing good about working from home. There's a few individual differences. People working less hours were less likely to mention long hours. Surprise, surprise. And if you look at personality differences, 55% of extroverts mentioned lack of contact, but 40% of introverts did as well. Twice as many people with a thinking preference mentioned distractions compared with those at a feeling preference. And this was even more clear at process pair level, where 17% of STs mentioned this an issue, but 10% of NFs, 9% of NTs, and no SFs. But I want to bring this conversation back to well-being, because that's where we started. And there were some questions in this latest research that did relate to well-being, or at least relate to how positive people felt about their job and their organization. And you can see those on the screen at the moment. So we created a scale, a positivity about work scale, by adding up those first four questions and taking away the last question. And those of you who like stats, we'll be pleased to hear that it had a good internal consistency reliability. And we look to see how that data panned out. And that chart there shows the average positivity score for each level of difference between the actual amount worked remotely and the third amount. People at the far left work remotely much less than they want to. People at the far right work remotely much more than they refer to. And people in the middle with a score of 0, exactly where we refer to, like Rich and 47% of other ISTPs. And you can see that mostly with a few blips, the closer to your third level you are, the greater your positivity about work. In fact, the data suggests that possibly the most positive folks are those who work remotely just a little bit more than what they think their preference is. But here's another finding which is going to relate to type. People who don't work remotely at all, who always work in the office, have, on average, a significantly lower positivity score than hybrid or entirely remote workers. And if we look at personality, there is a significant SN difference on the positivity score. And it's the only personality difference that we find. People with a sensing preference, that's that green bar, on average, have a higher score of positivity than those with intuitive preference. It's not a huge difference in real terms, but it is statistically significant. But if we look at non-remote workers, hybrid workers, and remote workers separately, we find something rather different. Sensing remote workers are a bit more positive than non-remote ones, but it's intuition that shows a big difference. Intuitives who don't work remotely at all, possibly who aren't allowed to work remotely at all, and we are going to do some further dives in the data to look at this, they are much less positive than others. And that's a big part of why overall non-remote workers have a lower average score on positivity, and maybe again says something about the importance of choice. Let's take this back to well-being and Rich's research, because back in 2019, Rich did look at well-being and how it related to work remotely. And very much in line with what we've just been looking at, remote workers did have a higher level of overall well-being. In 2021, that difference was still there, but it was much smaller. Of course, you can see in 2021, the overall level of well-being for all workers was lower as well. And in 2021, I guess remote working may have been forced on people rather than being a choice. So our style of working and how close that is to our preference does seem to have an effect on our well-being. But apart from perhaps changing your remote or hybrid or non-remote working pattern, what else can you do? What else can anyone do to improve workplace well-being? And this is when I say, Rich, over to you.
Thanks, John. So, as John mentioned, the remote working issue is a big part of people's well-being. It differs by type, but there are a number of other things that can also be related to your workplace well-being. And over the last 6 years or so, we've been asking a lot of different questions of people about the things that they do both at work and outside of work to improve their well-being. And we have a short list here. So go ahead and click the next button. So in terms of things that people can do at work, what we found is that a lot of what all types say are positive impacts on their work well-being are cognitive things. So it's focusing on tasks that are of interest, focusing on tasks that make you feel positive, take on work where you can learn something. We also see some, escapism, take some breaks, and taking on some challenges, trying to make things tougher on yourself. But it's really those very cognitive things that we see, and we see them pretty consistently across different types. But I will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Outside of work, we see differences in terms, or most people, I should say, of all types endorse the idea of spending time with family and friends. Again, you see some escapism, listen to music, read. The cognitive elements of focusing on positives, and then also activities. I will say that when we look at type, we don't see huge differences on these lists. We've done some qualitative work where we asked people, tell me more about, spending time with family and friends, for instance. And you do see some differences there where, not surprisingly, someone who's an ISTP will say spending time with people I actually like, whereas an ENFP will say something like spending time with pretty much anybody. So we've consolidated a lot of that information into a report that we have. And that report summarizes the work that we've done so far. I will say we are still doing some of that work. And you can download that off of the MBTI website. Click, please. And in that, we have some short type tips for different types in terms of the kinds of things that people can do to improve their well-being. Again, you will see some consistency across different types. There are some differences. We haven't fully integrated the qualitative work yet, but we are in the process of working on that. Next slide. So far in this talk, I think we've done a pretty thorough job of talking about what workplace well-being is. We've talked about why it's important. John walked through some impacts of the pandemic in terms of remote and hybrid working. And we very briefly talked about improving your workplace well-being, but I want to emphasize that you can download that report from the website and get a lot more information on that. And I think that's a wrap.
That is. So we just put a couple of questions there, which is probably goes without saying, but just something to a thought to go away with, or perhaps share in the exciting Kubo Space Lounge, which I know is coming up after this. But other than that, thank you for your time. I think we have 1 minute for questions, but we are happy to stay around for a bit longer if people have more questions.